if you have stakes in the Pacific, how do you essentially reach the Pacific? You have to transit the Indian Ocean. And this is a space that is right now, in a sense, fluid, because there's no major power that needs to be offset. But the Chinese are making decisive moves. And if you do not join with India in ensuring that this region is adequately securitized towards sustainability, then you might have a problem in accessing the markets of the Pacific.
An increasingly robust relationship between India and EU is also net positive to the US, is net positive to the EU, is net positive to us. I think we're all going to be... Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of WM Dialogues. I'm delighted once again to have my friend Professor Dattesh Parulekar as my guest today. And Dattesh, in fact, has been on a 5-country tour in Europe and spoken at numerous locations to a large part of the political and security establishment. So I'm sure he has a lot to tell us. Even I was fortunate to have been to Brussels recently for a Track 1.5 EU-India Security Dialogue. And Dattesh, what I noticed was an absolute sense of despondency in Europe for a variety of reasons, and I'm sure you can dwell on all of them. Of course, the biggest issue is the extreme amount of turbulence in the Europe-US relationship. And I would say some doubts regarding the US commitment to Europe, particularly from a security standpoint. And as a consequence of that, Europe, which has been historically spending 1% or sometimes even less than 1%, a few countries maybe more than 1% of their GDP on defense, now suddenly are being asked to cough up 3.5%, and 5% of course, but the remaining 1.5% in security related services, which is an extremely difficult thing for a nation which has got used to, high social security spending, a much softer form of life, the so-called European charmed existence, which they've had for all these past, 3 or 4 decades, is gradually, I would say, seems to be in its final stages. The other issue, of course, is Russia. And as a consequence of Russia, I would say, is energy, because the Russian energy supply has tapered out almost entirely. And therefore, energy costs, particularly for countries like Germany, have skyrocketed. Third, I would say, is demography. So on demography, you're seeing a demographic collapse in Europe. Birth rates are low, and there seems to be simultaneously a backlash against immigration. So it's a double whammy in that sense, to get their labor issues sorted out, etc. Lastly, I would say is that there is an extreme amount of internal political turbulence, and therefore it becomes very difficult for them to enact any policy and to see it through. Through various stages. So I think that sort of lays a little bit of the groundwork, but I'm sure you have a lot more to tell us after your tour over there. Can you first tell us about the tour you went to, and then you can talk about the discussions that took place.
So thank you very much, sir, for once again hosting me. It's always a pleasure to be with you in a conversation. So I was on a 3-week tour of Europe, as you said, and I was across 5 countries. So I had 4 or 5 engagements in Germany. I spoke to the German Defense Ministry, the German Maritime Command, so was able to address policymakers there. I also spoke to a slew of think tanks in collective meetings. Thereafter, I spoke at certain universities in the Netherlands and in Belgium. I was also invited to, in fact, do an interview for the national broadcaster of Netherlands, a program that will be aired in November end. I also happened to meet and have a certain briefing session with the External Action Service of the European Union at their headquarters. Also happened to go to France and to Sweden and speak in a number of locations. So it was a interesting mix of policymakers, university people, and think tankers.
And practitioners also?
Practitioners also, exactly. So it was well attended. And the reason I was able to put all these events together, that's also very important. A lot of people ask me about that, is that there was an interest to hear the India perspective, to India's story. So definitely India is the flavor of the season now in Europe, in terms of trying to understand how Indian strategic autonomy plays, how India's multi-alignment pans out, and where does Europe figure in India's strategic calculus. So yes, you raised some very important points. So let me add to that. I think one of the important things psychologically which is impacting European policymakers and at the popular level is this lack of confidence in the United States. All said and done, the US, Europe relationship has been driven by a bedrock of trust and stability. And even though Trump in his first term did make noises about leaving NATO, nobody ever believed that. They just thought that was a negotiating tactic. In this term, he's not talked of leaving NATO, but he's probably wrecked the boat much more than he's done in the first term, right? I mean, he's basically asking Europe, if you want to continue with the war in Ukraine and Russia,
you fund it,
then you fund it, and I'm going to basically give weapons. So America is going to sell weapons, you're going to fund it. You see the manner of the trade deal that was done. There was absolutely no sense of sensitivity for European interests, and Europe unfortunately literally folded up. So you can't charge Americans, tariff, but America can tariff your goods. Amongst all this, there is a squeeze of a different kind that's also happening. Just see the way in which the Chinese treated both President von der Leyen and Antonio Costa when they went to commemorate the 50th anniversary of ties. They were literally bussed into the meeting, right? And Xi Jinping is believed to literally talk down to themselves. So while Europe tends to believe that their relationship with China is a case of two equals, they say we are of the same GDP strength, etc. The Chinese don't see them that way. The Chinese that I talk to are so dismissive of Europe. They literally say this is a dying region, and this is a region which is getting swallowed up and mopped up by the Chinese. So that's another problem they have. Of course, the Russian factor is not going to go away. So that squeeze remains because Russia sits on their border. So as I keep saying, right now there is a triple whammy at the geopolitical level. You have an issue with Russia, you have an issue with China, and you can't trust your ally, the United States. So obviously you have to look at new players, and those new players don't reside in that part of the world. The new players reside here in the Indo-Pacific.
So absolutely. I mean, so in a sense, this is a time of opportunity for us.
Yeah.
So first, let's go back a little back on the final outcome. I mean, on NATO as such.
Yeah.
You said quite rightly that this time his approach has been different. He's not talking about exiting from NATO, but he has in a sense undermined NATO to a large extent. To the extent I think that there's even doubt in many European countries regarding his adherence to Article 5. In case something happens. And in fact, now they find that Article 5 happens to be quite loosely worded, in fact, so there's no firm commitment, it is for the nation to decide as to what degree of commitment should be there. So from a security perspective, at least in Europe, do you see an organization outside NATO sort of being stood up? I mean, France has talked about that from time to time, to have a European security initiative or something like that. It will be extremely difficult, of course, to recreate, the entire command structure of NATO, etc. But do you think that there will be a drift in that direction, or they're just, got no other alternative but to be, very much invested into NATO?
Yeah, so at one level, obviously, their hand is being forced, Europe's hand is being forced, that they have to look at other alternatives. But whether they can go back to something like the Nice Treaty, which could create a European defense force, and then problems will arise is about command and control structure. You have 27 members within the European Union. So who will lead it? Who will fund it? And if it's going to be by rotation, there are quite a few countries in the EU who are part of Europe but are more friendlier and more sympathetic to Russia. So in that sense, this could create greater dissonance. Also, we have to remember that right now at a political level, Europe is wrestling between the left and the right, And there are potential choices where the right could emerge as the winning coalition in few countries. So what would that do then to the command and control structure? So my sense is that although at a EU level there are a lot of noises being made, countries are still going to hedge their bets and look more at individual ways of securing their defense needs. And I think Germany is one of those countries which has not really had a defense orientation as much as, let's say, France has had. We've always said that France is more geopolitical, Germany is more of an economic actor. But you see the noises that are being made, not just by their ambassador here, but by their foreign minister, defense minister, etc., where they're actually looking to make a strong defense commitment to the Indo-Pacific. They want to engineer a defense orientation of Germany, and they see India as a very, very critical part of that wheel. So I think you will have individual countries now looking at their own security, looking to ramp that up, and if that can feed into the EU mission, then so be it. But I don't see an EU kind of a mechanism.
So in a sense, you brought the issue regarding Germany, and I would say Germany is probably the worst hit country of the lot. They have historically underinvested in security for decades together. And right now, in fact, now they find themselves, and I think they were most dependent on energy from Russia amongst all the European countries. So they are in dire straits really, and they, I think, are looking for new partners in that respect. And firstly, of course, is to manage the internal economic situation, because it's in a pretty bad shape. The other issue I think that Germany faces is that historically their industry, I don't think has been able to adapt as rapidly to changing requirements. For instance, the automobile industry, if you take. They've invested decades into perfecting the internal combustion engine until it becomes, a fine art practically, you see. Now suddenly you have a totally different, means of propulsion, which is electric. So decades of effort which have gone into this is now going not. I mean, the return on that investment is going to be low. I mean, it's progressively tapering right now, and it's going to sort of peter out in that sense. But coming to the other issue that you mentioned about Germany, etc., that because they're in the situation that they're looking at other partners, but do they have the economic heft to follow through on this? Because if that committed into Europe, if there's such a strong requirement for them to ramp up, and the Russian threat still looms large. In that sense, do they have the ability and the bandwidth to engage? And that not only applies to Germany, but I would say the EU generally.
Yeah, so obviously Russia still looms large, as you said, and I could see that in my meetings there. There was almost overwhelming obsession with Russia all the time. But I think again here it's a matter of compulsion. It's about the inevitability of what's going to happen. Increasingly, the European Union and individual European countries have framed their Indo-Pacific policy. They are increasingly now integrating or at least building up economic agreements with East Asian economies, with Australia, of course with India as well in the works. So there is a lot of economic engagement that is quite existential for them in the Pacific side of the Indo-Pacific, if I may say so. And that's why I don't think they're left with any option if they need an off-ramp, because Europe is saturating, the markets are not there. The global south markets are not going to be able to supplant your advanced markets. And they have to look for oil and they have to look for gas in particular, away from Russia. So that means they have to look at other geographies. And so the Indo-Pacific becomes a compulsion. I don't think it's any longer a choice. It's something that they have to do if they have to be able to create some survival or some sustainability long term. Otherwise, their economics is not going to be able to justify any of their actions.
So while I fully agree that the Indo-Pacific becomes, an essential requirement for them from an economic perspective. But from a security perspective, I was wondering, when do they have the ability, when they've got a Russian threat? Firstly, I wanted to even ask you, as a conjoined question was this, is the Russian threat, so-called Russian threat, sometimes you feel that in Europe this threat seems to be overblown. I mean, Russia has practically depleted a large part of the resources in combating a relatively small country, might be large geographically, but small in terms of population and wherewithal, in Ukraine. To even contemplate that Russia has a residual power now to walk into large swaths of Europe, to me seems far-fetched. And a lot of even American commentators say so, that this is a threat in being that, that Europe seems to have taken totally out of context, and so much concern about a threat, the probability of which occurring is extremely minuscule. So that is one part of the question. And the second is that, do you feel that there's a bifurcation now, that they're economically, I mean from a geo-economic perspective, their outreach towards the Indo-Pacific will be large, but from a geostrategic or from a security standpoint, it will be much more Europe-centric?
Yeah, so firstly on the Russia thing, I agree with you that, when we look at it, it would seem that it's overblown. Of course, the European argument is just look at what Russia is doing to undermine countries like, for example, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all of that, what they're doing in Poland, how they're trying to allegedly fund some of these right-wing parties in Europe, so trying to meddle in the politics. So the feeling is that, no, don't look at it only as a security problem. They basically want to essentially bring about a certain demise of Europe as it existed. But I agree with you that, Russia walking into large swaths of Europe, or even for that matter, attacking large parts of Europe won't happen. A bigger issue is, preparing yourself for the new age warfare that we're looking at. So greater chances of Russia accelerating cyber attacks and, doing this kind of, subsea warfare, etc., for which Europe needs to gear itself. Europe is still living in the conventional mold and not quite investing in technologies that will make it ready for new age warfare. So that's one. The second point is that when it comes to, the Indo-Pacific, It was an interesting question asked to me by certain German, constituencies. And they said, Professor, one of the problems we have is to make Europeans appreciate that there is a certain existentialism that exists for them in the Indo-Pacific. They are so Europe-centric that they don't believe that we need to walk away from Europe into something as far as the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific for that matter. But in the same vein, they would make the argument that we have economic stakes in the Pacific. So my immediate question to them was that if you have stakes in the Pacific, how do you essentially reach the Pacific? You have to transit the Indian Ocean. And this is a space that is right now, in a sense, fluid, because there's no major power that needs to be offset. But the Chinese are making decisive moves. And if you do not join with India in ensuring that this region is adequately securitized towards sustainability, then you might have a problem in accessing the markets of the Pacific. So there is a fundamental perception problem and appreciation problem of strategic dynamics, because they don't seem to be able to understand anything more than conventional warfare. So things like, subsea warfare, underwater domain awareness, these things, although they are investing in technologies, they're not able to see how it can be part of an active statecraft.
So actually it's surprising, because Europe used to be, I think, particularly from an innovation standpoint, etc., quite well advanced.
Yeah.
So their lethargy or their inability to sort of adapt themselves, is pretty surprising, I would say. One of the things being talked about, with the American drawdown, you can say, or I would say, if not even drawdown, but lack of, assurance from the US side to participate in any sort of either any contingency either in the Western Pacific or, in other parts of the globe, is the formation of a sort of a middle power coalition, in which, typically we've always talked of countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, maybe Indonesia. You think Europe can be a part of this? Because actually from a security standpoint, they are almost in the middle power status.
Yeah, so it was very interesting. So when I was making the India pitch, there would be some European commentators who would kind of nudgingly try to suggest that, our GDP is 19 trillion, almost the same as China. But that's when you put it in composite terms. Europe doesn't behave that way. And even if you are 19 trillion, you are largely an economic actor, not a security or political actor. But let me say this, I think there has been an appreciation, at least at the European Union, European Commission level, because in the last couple of years, we have seen an initiative called EVISA, which is enhancing, which is enhancing security in and with Asia. Now, there are 8 partners there, right? And if you see those 8 partners are all very interesting. They span from India and the Indian Ocean to Indonesia to a lot of ASEAN countries and South Korea and Japan. And the whole idea is to found this particular initiative on 3 pillars. So first pillar is regional dialogue, where you deepen the dialogue on security, and of course maritime issues will be front and center, but also to build operational mechanisms and do a lot of public diplomacy in terms of stakeholder consciousness.
Right.
So there is an appreciation now, at least in the Commission. And we must be very fair that I think President von der Leyen deserves a lot of credit. She's been making very systematic moves to move the needle of Europe to appreciate the Indo-Pacific. Let's remember earlier this year on the 28th of February, which was the start of her second term, she did something seminal. She came to India for the summit, India summit, but she brought the entire collegiate of commissioners here, which has never happened in the history with any country. Let's also remember, under her stewardship, we have been able to establish, India and the EU, the Trade and Technology Council. And the Europeans have done this only with 2 countries. One is the United States, one is India, not with China. So that tells you a lot. Their supply chains are embedded in China, but they've never trusted China with technology.
Right.
They are willing to do that with India. Now, what happens is through ESIVA, through many of these initiatives, there can be this middle power coalition that can be built. And let me add one interesting strategy. When they did ask me what kind of initiatives they could be part of. So I was thinking, what is one of the common problems that all these countries have, middle powers have? Their supply chains are embedded in China and they're not able to de-risk themselves. After the pandemic, we had an initiative called the SCRI, the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative.
Right.
The whole idea behind SCRI was not to make it the Quad, otherwise it would be in the Quad.
Yeah.
It was outside the Quad because don't bring in the United States willy-nilly into everything, because then it becomes a US-China bipolarity, everything else becomes secondary. Resident powers in the Indo-Pacific should have agency on something like de-risking from China. So Japan, Australia, India got together and created it. Japan wanted ASEAN. Somehow India was not comfortable because of issues that we have with ASEAN. So unfortunately, it only remained the three countries. And it has floundered to a certain extent. It has not got legs. If the European Union, which is now looking to strategically align with countries, middle power countries in the Indo-Pacific, if they can align themselves with the SCRI in what would be an expanded SCRI or an SCRI plus, then I think Japan, Australia, India and the EU, firstly, all four of them are largely seen as economic actors and not geopolitical actors. They prioritize economics. Second, all four have this dilemma, conundrum of supply chains and how to de-risk. Right. Each one brings a certain core competency to the table. So finance, tech, etc. comes into the picture. Yeah. So holistically speaking, something like an SCRI plus with the bringing in of the European Union could be one of the ways where middle power coalition could effectively deliver something in the Indo-Pacific.
Got that. So, another issue that I wanted to ask you was that from a security perspective, hitherto when we talk to that part of the world, we normally have been talking on a bilateral basis with, either UK, France, Germany, all the key countries over there, some of the Nordic countries, etc. If we were to sort of move ahead in a security relationship with Europe, is it better to build on our bilateral relationships, or is it better to speak to EU as the enabling organization for that? What do you say? And what is the friction between these two approaches? Is it?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So let me just dwell on this a little bit. I think one of the strong points of Prime Minister Modi's tenure now, almost 11 and a half, 12 years, has been the fact that he has invested a lot of political capital in Europe. And these strong relationships you talked about, in the past, our strong relationships used to be largely with the big three. And that time, of course, UK was part of Europe. Yeah. So we used to always talk of relationship with France, Germany and the UK. And that's where Europe largely ended for us.
Right.
What we have done over the last 11 and a half years is to identify countries across the geography of what is Europe. Yeah. So and paint our engagement with them on a wider canvas.
So Spain, Italy.
Yeah, Spain, Italy, even the Nordics.
Nordic countries, yeah.
So for example, we have a blue economy dialogue with the Nordics, with Norway. Yeah. With Sweden, we do biosciences. Of course, we used to do defense as well, all of that. With Finland, we are doing digital education. With Denmark is a partner country in our Maritime India vision.
Right.
Because of the way they handled, even with Netherlands, we do smart agriculture, we do water management, etc. Yeah. So identifying the core areas of every country and bringing them into the mix. I believe that any relationship to be enduring must have strong bilateralism at the core. Yeah. And that becomes the foundation to build on a regional or a multilateral relationship. Right. Otherwise, the multilateral relationship is weak at its core. Because we have done this legwork with a whole range of countries, there is today no country in the European Union that is a dead set country against India. I was having this conversation with the External Action Service members who handle the Indo-Pacific, and we agreed mutually that when it comes to China, although China has this huge heft, there are few countries, particularly Nordic countries, who are uncomfortable with China totally. And they would probably even go to the extent of vetoing China. There's no country in the 27 that is like an adversary of India. So that's why the European Council on October 20th was able to adopt lock, stock and barrel the strategic agenda that's been laid out by the European Commission on 17 September when they came out with a joint communication. Now, how do we arrange this? So there is strong bilateralism which has to grow in many areas. But along with that, our relationship with the European Commission and the European Union also has to grow. Right now, if you see the latest joint communication, there are 5 pillars that have been identified mutually as to how to advance it. Now, other pillars are well known. I think the one pillar that's going to be more important for us is the defense and security pillar. How do we build on that? Economic, we know how to build that pillar through FTA and other things. In the defense and security agreement, my point is, can India and the EU look at the template we had with the Americans in Trump's first term, where we signed 4 foundational agreements? So can we replicate a COMCASA, a BECA, an ISA and a LEMOA, at the EU level, right? Now that will challenge the EU to build consensus.
Yeah, but I don't think they have that right now.
They don't have it. They don't have it. Yeah. But if our defense dialogue, and we have a dialogue now with them, set up in June of this year, if this dialogue can take up these issues, that what can we do on the lines of basically subsea warfare? How do we better map our ocean floor? How do we work on logistics exchange, right, at the EU level? Right. How can we work on defense collaboration? Because one thing we are talking about right now is, Europe giving us this, that and the other. So for example, the ThyssenKrupp deal for the 6 submarines is a good one. But we have to move beyond it. That's why I liked what the Ambassador Ackerman said in the IPRD in the last couple of days, that Germany and India now are going to move forward to jointly develop modern defense systems. So the defense industry collaboration forum of the European Commission and India is going to be key, because that is where you will move beyond simply talking transactions. You'll be talking TOT, you'll be talking, interaction, ecosystems coming together. How can India's small and medium sector enterprises be part of the defense ecosystem? How can there be joint development? I'm just hearing that on the Safran engines. I believe that the talk is now to start from scratch. Do an entire joint, development.
Because I think they're looking at a 110 kilonewton engine which does not exist really.
Yes, exactly. Similarly, you have the Blue Raman, which is the deep sea cable that, the 11,700 kilometer cable that is linking up with third countries. So I think we have to identify key technology, key sustainability initiatives, and then drive them in an actionable way. And I think the TTC is ideally placed to do this. I think the TTC has to be invested in by both European Union and India.
So, one issue when you talked about this, increasing collaboration on the material side, co-development and co-production, etc. But our market, of course, is limited, and there are many people who are eyeing our market. And here, of course, there's a Russian side, etc. But I want to talk about the US here. As we ramp up our, on the defense production side, our collaboration with the US, do you see, with Europe, do you see this coming into conflict with our relationship with the US? Because the US is also becoming quite pushy in this respect, on the commercial side of a relationship,
Yeah, so I think right now, see, the pressure from the US is going to be there willy-nilly. I mean, the way, for example, let me put it this way. I deeply appreciate the President von der Leyen's position, because just recently Trump in fact almost ordered the European Union to penalize India, to sanction India, right? And they actually have stood very firm and said, no, we won't do it. So these pressures that Europe has faced, India also will face similar pressures. I think what we have got into under the Trump administration, because Trump has himself contributed to it, is every country now is pretty convinced that we have to diversify. So we will absorb the pressure. Yeah, there will be some hits and misses. There will be some losses we have to take, some hits we have to take. But diversification is the only way. And I think India, with its aspirational status, its rising power, growing at 6.7% now, going to be the third largest economy by 2030, a country of 1.4 billion people with a median age of 31. I think all of this places us in what I call as distributed leverage. So we have leverage that is quite distributed. So we can do things with a lot of different players, and I don't think it necessarily has to conflict. A bigger conflict could be the Russia-US thing going forward. It could become a problem. But I don't think EU or Europe or US could be that big a problem if we are able to find spheres of influence for both sides. And I think we can do that. There's enough of a market for us to do it. We could also do what we could also do with Europe is actually do more triangular, more third party or third country development. Another point I want to make here. Now we have the Colombo Security Conclave, right? We have now 6 countries. Seychelles is going to join. Now the
Seychelles already there.
They recently joined, yeah. So 6 countries here. Bangladesh, let's see what happens with them, whether they continue or not. But it's very important now for the EU, which is a developmental actor and which wants to actually capacitate, small countries. These countries become very important. So could we have an EU-India strategic compact for these small island developing states, right? And could we then build? Because here what you do, you build on land, you build ecosystems across a broad canvas, you also work in the maritime domain.
Right.
So we don't have to necessarily make it an EU-US. US will have its own space in the Indian Ocean, etc. if they want to play. With Europe, we can carve out curated geographies and then work with them so that it doesn't lead to a conflict with the United States. I think a little more craft will be involved.
I fully agree with you. But do you see in any way that, of course, while we do these independently with the different players, as you've mentioned, is there also space for India, US, EU, some construct, or that will become too unwieldy, and I think that might, be difficult to implement? Yeah,
so I think, at the technological, logistical, industrial level, it will be too difficult because, again, standards will be difficult. One of the things we will have a problem, I mean, we are all talking about it now, but proof of the pudding is in the eating. So when we start implementing this India-EU, agreements, we will then realize whether regulatory, problems actually come in the way. So I would still say that that's too unwieldy.
Yeah.
But what we could do is India, US, EU could actually play a greater role in terms of regional security. So when it comes to naval operations, military operations, which we have been doing, so EU's NAVFOR with India, with US, through the CTF, etc., there can be a lot more actionable cooperation in terms of maritime security missions, something more localized. But something more strategic, I think will be very difficult, particularly when the Americans are no longer as reliable as they used to be.
But fundamentally, I don't see a conflict, it's going to be net positive for everyone. That is going to be an increasingly robust relationship between India and EU is also net positive to the US, is net positive to the EU, is net positive to us. I think we're all going to be beneficiaries out of this.
Absolutely.
And plus net positive for the region. Yeah, because, because then you have much more a collaborative effort in which everyone plays to their strengths, really. So we've covered a lot of ground, Dattesh. Is there any sort of closing thoughts you'd like to add to this discussion?
Yeah, so the closing thought would be that I think one of the good things with India and the EU, and this should be said very clearly, we've never seen this kind of political momentum that we have right now. I mean, this year, if you see the number of meetings that have happened, particularly not just at the phone calls that, von der Leyen and Modi have had, but even the meetings between Brussels and our Commerce Ministry, Foreign Ministry, we've never seen this happen before. And I think we have now reached the sweet spot to crack the deal. You might have heard that in the last 2-3 days, we are hearing that both President von der Leyen and Antonio Costa are most likely invited for the Republic Day as our chief guests.
Okay.
And that news has broken, and I think they've almost agreed. Now that would be unique because Prime Minister Modi did it once with ASEAN and he's now doing it with them. But to send a message that European Union matters and we see it as an entity with whom we want to have a strategic partnership.
And to have both come together.
Both come together. And let's remember that, Antonio Costa is a very interesting story.
I mean,
he's our own man. He's from Goa, right?
Yeah.
So he's our most distinguished non-resident Indian, if I may say so.
Yeah.
So that investment that we have made in the goodwill, I think will hold us in good stead. So I see that if we can crack the FTA, which may happen by the end of the month, end of the year, may not happen maybe by the beginning of next year. But beyond that, I think India and the EU, I've been saying this all across my Europe trip, we have this India way, right? Many of the skeptics and critics say, oh, it's nothing but Nehruvianism which is back. But with all respect, let me submit, it's not Nehruvianism that is back. Our India way today is not navigating between Pax Sinica and Pax Americana. It's very subtly putting out a third way. And a third way which provides an off-ramp from these two ways, which are mutually, reductionist.
Right.
Europe is the ideal player to be able to join the third way.
Right.
And so India and EU could actually forge, along with other middle power coalitions, a third way which will be distinct, which will be empowering of the global south and will hopefully build security, stability and sustainability.
Anyway, in fact, I had said this would be the last question, but you brought out an interesting point over here. I mean, the other, what is being marketed as the other avenue to the third way is a formation like BRICS. So, So do you see a conflict over there? I mean, because...
No. So I think what happens is, of course, BRICS, and this is something I believe in. I think India is not well appreciated both in the Quad and the BRICS in terms of what we bring to that. I think India is a major factor, anchor for stability. Our presence in Quad ensures that the Quad doesn't become essentially an anti-China forum.
Right.
We are able to keep it that way. Otherwise, it will simply become that.
And similarly in BRICS also.
In BRICS, we ensure it doesn't become an anti-US forum.
Yeah.
Because when this whole BRICS currency discussion was going on, what did India say? We are not for a BRICS currency because it aims to bring down the dollar.
Right.
Let's look at it positively. So we are for currency multipolarity.
Yeah.
So India's presence is to keep BRICS from becoming anti-US and to keep the Quad from becoming anti-China.
Right.
And that is something that even the EU would like to see.
Right.
So EU, India, potentially, other middle power
We're aligned really.
We're aligned. And we could actually bring that stability, security and sustainability.
So thanks again, Dattesh.
Pleasure.
Always delightful to speak to you, and I'm sure we'll have many such conversations.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.